Great. It looks as though everyone is pretty much arrived. So I'm going to kick off our conference. Hello, welcome to the inaugural Western Region Homeland Security Advisory Council First Responder Mental Health Resilience Conference. I'm Lillian Lennox. I'm a mental health professional, founder of Life Breath Training, team member of the Western Massachusetts Critical Incident Stress Management Team, and co-moderator along with Rain Brown, who is the Homeland Security Program Manager, Franklin Regional Council of Governments for this conference series. Unfortunately, Rain will not be joining us today. She's not feeling well. She literally doesn't have the voice. However, Rain will be available should you need to reach out to her for questions. And those contact details will be posted in the chat box in just a few minutes. So just a few words about this conference. Several years ago, the council launched the Western Region Homeland Security Advisory Council Mental Health Resilience Project. And the primary objective of the project is to create sustainable resources for the Western Massachusetts first responder community. And this conference stands as one such resource, helping to build community, connection through learning, through sharing across disciplines, with a focus of prevention of psychological stress injury and increasing mental health resilience, mind-body resilience. Just a word about trauma-informed. So this conference will incorporate a trauma-informed approach, and that is a collaborative and profound approach for us. And in the spirit of trauma-informed approach, we invite you to engage in all session activities while maintaining self-care. Take a break from the training if needed. Understanding the sessions are not therapy nor a replacement for therapy. And please send us a private chat via the chat box if you'd like to connect for additional mental health resources. A caution also not to disclose or describe traumatic material, and to speak from your own experience, because your own experience profoundly matters, and also to assume the best intentions across this community of learning and sharing across disciplines. And this trauma-informed collaborative approach respects lived experience and the depth of the work and your work in particular on the front line. So very briefly now, just running through some housekeeping notes. A key purpose of the evaluation is to keep all first responders in your organizations safe and resilient. And we'd like to know moving forward, were these sessions effective? You'll be receiving a link to a survey at the end of the day. And we very much appreciate your feedback, as it will dynamically shape our next steps, future trainings, and future conferences moving forward. Our tech people, should you have any tech issues, are Rachel and Jackie. Please feel free to reach out to them via the chat box. Most sessions will be recorded and available at a time post-conference, not immediately. We'll need some time to process. However, they will be available. A link to register for this conference will be available in the chat box. It's being posted right now. Feel free to circulate to your colleagues, friends, families, as we have another action-packed Thursday coming up next Thursday, which will be our last conference day in this series. And just one last point, each presentation and workshop will offer a Q&A time towards the end. We'll feel free to post your questions in the chat box. We have an extraordinary lineup of expert presenters and workshops on offer today. And now to formally launch the third day of the First Responder Mental Health Resilience Conference, please welcome Chaplain Bruce Arbor. Bruce is a US Navy veteran and former firefighter. Bruce is Assistant Chief Chaplain with the Massachusetts Corps of Fire Chaplains and a member of the Western Massachusetts Critical Incident Stress Management Team. Welcome, Bruce, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be here today and to have a chance to open this. I feel very honored to be here. Just a little update. I actually was promoted to Chief of Chaplains. I retired from parish ministry after 36 years, and they decided I had a lot of extra time, so they gave me more responsibilities. Isn't that the way life is? This morning, I'm going to kick our day off by just talking a little bit about the role of spirituality in our well-being and the way in which we manage our stress and also build our resiliency for facing traumatic events. It's important to understand that when we're talking about spirituality, we're not talking about a specific religion or philosophy. We are talking about the human response to the ability of the human response to address spiritual needs and the role of spiritual understanding that plays in our human existence. Chaplaincy, for instance, is dedicated to serving the emotional, the physical, and the spiritual needs of first responders as they define it. And so when we talk about spirituality, it's really individualized in terms of how we address it and how we support it. So when we talk about spirituality and its role in our well-being, as I said, you're going to define that spirituality in whatever way that your personal belief system and your tradition has shaped you. Spirituality plays an important role because it's directly connected to our sense of hope. And spirituality is one of those human abilities to believe or be able to communicate and conceptualize something that is not visible. I don't know of any other creature that's able to communicate that on the face of the earth. And so that's unique to us. And it is one of the things that can either be an asset or a hindrance. The hindrance usually comes in when the belief system is violated. And traumatic events can create that violation or that injury to our belief system. And so the care of the spiritual self is so important, and understanding that and how it's connected to our hope, because hope is another thing. We talk about hope, but what is hope? We can't, there's not a visual to this, it's not tangible, but yet it's something that's key to our human existence. When we become hopeless, we also become powerless. And so we know the negative effects of a loss of hope. There's been some great studies done, in particular in the military, and the military really aligns more with first responders than most studies, because my practice, part of my practice in retirement is I've opened a trauma-informed specialized practice helping first responders, and the practice has grown to others that are not working in our field, but have suffered a traumatic event in their life. What's interesting is that studies have shown that people respond well to various forms of therapy, such as EMDR, havening technique, hypnosis, these kinds of things that can help deprogram or desensitize the distress that's attached to traumas. But most people will experience a trauma in their life. And so they might experience the burning of their home, or a severe car accident, or a loss of a significant loved one, or a dramatic shift in their health. These are major traumas that take place in their life, and most likely they'll have one of these. Rarely, in some rare circumstances, they'll have two or three. For first responder, we know that when we go to work, we face the potential of facing a trauma every single day. And it doesn't mean that it happens every day, but it just means that we're going to live under a high level of stress because we're walking into sort of abnormal situations. We're walking into everybody else's stress and trauma, and having to care for them and to try to turn that event into a positive outcome. That is what drives us, but it's also what wears us out. And we know that we will have many of those. And so, excuse me, it's not a matter of If I'm going to experience a high level of stress or trauma, it's when I'm going to experience it. And the potential is always there to experience it, to have that event happen in our day. And of course, because of the environment we work in, we also have the effects of cumulative stress. And cumulative stress, of course, as you know, is more difficult to pinpoint as to the cause of. So often when we our coping mechanism breaks down, it's because it's worn out. And so it may seem like a minor event that has been our breaking point. And so it's much more difficult to then identify the beginning point. Where do we address this trauma? So where does spirituality fit in this, and our resiliency, and in our understanding of how do we get to that point of being traumatized, and especially our spiritual self being traumatized? And so what some Army chaplains did is they did some studies to understand the soldier in the field. And they found that when people experience traumatic events, they also experience a spiritual injury. And that spiritual injury comes in many forms. I'm just going to throw a slide up here to share with you on my screen. These are some of the symptoms of a spiritual injury. So it can be a loss of faith, and so a loss of a particular faith system, a difficulty with a religious belief system. And so that's often our upbringing of how we have been taught how things should work in life based on religious beliefs. Betrayal of the deity or God, how can a God let something like this happen? The spirituality empty or depleted, and that's where the spiritual self hasn't been cared for, or it's been challenged so many times that it gets depleted. And then the frustration with fairness. Humanity, since the beginning of time, has always struggled with, why do the righteous suffer? And it's just not right. It's not fair. And so that's one of our symptoms of spiritual injury. And then hopeless and powerlessness. And so of these things, you can see how, if we've dependent on our spirituality to be our support, our driving force, our understanding of how all of creation is supposed to stay in this particular balance. And then we run into those traumatic events where maybe it's the death of a child, maybe it's seeing a young parent go through a major illness, seeing somebody who is living alone and living very sadly, and having to respond to that home and to find that individual in that hopeless, helpless state. These can challenge our understanding of our spiritual self and the order of the world. And when this happens, of course, it can take and break our sense of what the world is about. In a sense, we live in this state of naiveness, which is a wonderful thing. We say that denial is more than just a river that runs through Egypt. It's a great system to help us sustain ourselves through a difficult time. And so denial and numbness aren't bad. They're actually part of our survival system. But when that affects our spirituality, it can then affect our concept or our ability to hope. And when that happens, we're in a very vulnerable state. You'll hear of people who are wrestling with things like depression or suicidology, and they'll talk about hopelessness and how they struggle for that hope, how they're trying to find that hope. And it can be a very serious state to be in, because hope really drives our desire for survival. And so when we talk about these things, we can learn some from the battlefield as to how this spirituality can then help us deal with this potential injury when we're facing traumatic situations. And so I just there's a list of things that we can learn from the battlefield trauma. How does our spirituality, how can it help us rather than hurt us? How can it support us rather than leave us feeling powerless? And what are the things that it can do to us, and then how can we respond out of our sense of self and our spiritual understanding. So some of the things we learn from, and just go to another slide here, from the battlefield is that it's similar to first responders. Traumatic stress, not a matter of if, but when. It disrupts and even can cause a loss of spiritual understanding of life. And like I say, an event breaks all the rules of fairness, and a loss of innocence, meaning, and purpose. And that's, for the soldier in the field, they're told that they're out there for the greater cause. They're there to right the wrongs of life. And then they get into battle. And they experience what it's like to be in battle and to see the unfairness. The soldier once told me about a situation that he was in where they had gone into a village and they were looking for some terrorists in this village. And so as they went from door to door, they busted one of the doors open looking that they had been told these terrorists were in, and they found a room full of children. He was severely traumatized by that. Because either in a split second had to make a decision. Does he fire his weapon? Are the children a threat? Whoever thinks of children being a threat. And so the innocence and the meaning and the purpose of why they're there gets challenged, and their belief system then, because they believe they were there for the right reasons and the right cause, and they are. But it gets challenged. It's not so black and white anymore. There can be severe guilt attached to our survival, and when you put it in religious terms or in spiritual terms, why them and not me? And that's usually what we talk when we're talking about survival. And it can complicate our grieving process as well. And so the grief that is driven and complicated by religious thought, that it's not right that this person died. And when we talk about grieving, we need to remember that grieving is not just about losses that we have, but it can be vicarious grieving that we have for individuals that we're trying to help, that we're trying to serve. Excuse me. And so
pointed to a time check right now.
Okay. So I've got about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Okay. So when we're talking about complicated grieving, it can be complicated by our religious beliefs. And the faith can help, but also can hinder coping and complex recovery. And sometimes that is because the need to accept that things just aren't fair. And our religious understandings or our faith understandings or spiritual understandings can interfere with that. And that we have faith and religious beliefs also can be very supportive in recovery. It can be the thing that that helps us restore our sense of fairness again, and by that inner searching. So, oops, let me come back to me again. Oh, wrong way. I did come back to me, sorry. We know that there are practices, and this is the last thing I want to talk about in terms of a spiritual care, spiritual understanding. We know there are many practices within religious organizations and traditions, as well as other forms of spiritual understanding. And so whether you're calling the process prayer or meditation or some other mindful practice, we know that it has a profound effect on the brain. And so I'm going to share I had taken a picture of this. I couldn't find a slide for this. It's from Jennifer Sweeten's trauma treatment toolbox, where she talks about the benefits of meditation on your brain. And you can see that there's an increase in the thinking. There's increases in self-regulation center for emotional regulation, normalizes interception center, and decreases the fear center, which of course we know that the fear center in particular is the area where traumas become coded, and the distress from that trauma continue on. So the piece of that I want to leave with you is that when we talk about spirituality, however you define it, practicing good spiritual disciplines can be a benefit to building resiliency and building recovery from traumatic events. There is an awareness, a spiritual awareness that motivates and helps us to keep ourselves healthy. And so I hope, and this is just the dynamics, I'm kind of running out of time, so I'll quickly go through this, but just the thoughts, the emotion, the physical sensations, and the spiritual awareness all play a role in our wellness of who we are and how we work within this very stressful environment. And so I just want to encourage you to take some time and either in meditation, in prayer, whatever your tradition is, but to allow for that to be part of your wellness, part of your self-care. It's just one more piece in our journey of needing to take time for you. And that's often what we don't do, is take time for ourselves. We're very good at taking care of everyone else, but when it comes time to taking care of ourselves, we're not very good at it. So be well, be safe, and take care. And I hand this over now to, and I can't see you, Lillian. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bruce.
You're welcome.
Congratulations on your promotion.
And thanks.
So helpful to understand spiritual injury, as I have never ever heard it explained that way. So thank you so much for opening our conference today. Hello, everybody. I'm Lillian Lennox, and we are now going to move into welcoming our featured speaker, Dr. Rollin McCraty. Dr. McCraty is the Director of Research at the Heart Math Institute and Research Center. And today, Dr. McCraty will present on maintaining your composure in the midst of chaos and confusion. Without further ado, welcome, Dr. McCraty.
Well, thank you, Lillian, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you. Let me share slides here so we can get going. As Lillian said, I want to kind of speak to the way in which we really can maintain our composure when the blank's hitting the fan, right in the middle of chaos and confusion. And a lot of that has to do with really being able to keep our physiology in what we call a coherent state. Just a little bit of background. I'm a psychophysiologist, so I've really been studying the physiology of optimal function, optimal performance, the physiology of emotion, how that drives the activity in our brain and our nervous system. And I've been at it for about 30 years now in this field, and we're basically a nonprofit research center, and have published many studies in a lot of different journals relative to our field, so you can get an idea. So we're very much research based. And one of the would say that I had the honor to be directly involved in was developing the resilience program for the U.S. Navy. And specifically, our work with the Navy got involved after they had done a mental health needs assessment across the entire Navy. And I won't go into a lot of detail here, but a couple of surprises came out of that work and that research. One was they found that the mission of detainee operations was by far the highest stress job or occupation in the Navy. And at that time, Navy personnel were being pulled from across the Navy to basically be the prison guards in Afghanistan and various these camps. And I worked. So anyway, they did about a year of research to find out how can we really help these people. They were kind of told by, the Navy Surgeon General that we shall do something to help these men and women. And so they spent about a year vetting programs and decided to go with our program. And the Navy actually had a really good model for resilience, probably best of all the military services, in my opinion. But what it lacked, as do most of them, is the practical how-to. How do we really do these things that the theory says we should do? And that's why they asked us to work with them. And I worked very closely with the the operational stress control officer for the Navy. And so I was personally involved during that era of training about 5,000 men and women myself, and got to know a lot about them. I'm ex-military myself, so I had a fairly good grounding in that. But basically, the sailors, let me just cut through here, because one of the metrics we were able to get to from a research perspective was the number of these men and women on prescription sleep medications. And for what had been going on is, after about 3 months of deployment, 80% of these men and women were on a prescription sleep medication. And of course, it's well known in my field that one of the first symptoms of stress, psychological stress, is sleep disruption. And we learned a lot about how you create cultural change over the 5 years that we worked together on this. And by the end of it, we had less than 5% on sleep medications for the entire year deployment. So these kind of trainings and resilience programs can be quite effective if they're appropriately done. And that's where the work really was, and learning was, how do we really sustain this? How do we really make this work operationally in the field, on the battlefield, if you will? And that's where a lot of learning had to take place, because it's easy to teach this, but it's how do you sustain it? And how do you make it practical in the real world? Now, in the first responder community, we have a partnership with Blue Courage. I suspect a lot of you have heard of them and know maybe Michael Neela, who founded Blue Courage. He's an ex-commander from Chicago Police Force, and has really just focused on providing resilience training to basically the first responder and law enforcement community. And so HeartMath is, in our tools and techniques, is the core of his self-management and resilience part of his program. So they've been a wonderful partner and remain to be a wonderful partner. In fact, I think following my presentation, Jen Hart, who is part of the Blue Courage team, is going to take you through some of the more practical how-tos of this. Our definition of resilience, and I know that's a term that's a lot out there these days, and a lot of people are kind of getting resilience fatigue in some ways, because it becomes almost overdone in a way in some communities. But our definition of resilience is a little different. And in fact, I'm kind of honored to say it was adopted by the Navy and some other organizations. As most resilience definitions have to do with bouncing back after a trauma or a challenge. It's pretty much the core of most definitions. But so we define it as the capacity to prepare for, recover from, and adapt in the face of stress, challenge, or adversity. Now, there's some important differences here. Capacity being one. It used to be thought, in the old days, if I'll say that, not that many years ago, that resilience was something you either had or you didn't have, right? You're born with it, but we now know that that's not the case. Of course, we all have different levels of this, but capacity is something that we can add to or be reduced. And prepare for is a huge factor, in that if we really learn how to prepare our physiology, our mental, emotional, self-regulation skills, that can really offset and avoid a lot of the things that we have to recover from. So these are important new concepts. So it's a proactive way, by really learning to understand basically energy management. What I'm talking about here is a way to really reduce stress and sustain our energy and perform better and prevent the long-term effects of stress buildup. Now, I kind of look at 4 primary domains and you could call these domains of energy as easily as we could resilience, because they're really the same thing, the amount of inner energy we have. And so I metaphorically think of having an inner battery, right? We have about a amount of energy in an inner battery, and that's how much energy we have to expend before it has to be recharged. But think of, so if we're thinking physically, right, that's pretty obvious, right? If we're going to measure that, what's the strength, what's the endurance, what's our flexibility? These are things that would reflect our resilience or energy in the physical domain. And it's pretty easy to understand how we can build capacity there. Let's say that we can, I don't know, doesn't matter what it is, maybe run 3 miles, right? That's our current capacity before we run out of energy. So we can kind of dig in a little bit and stretch past that, maybe run 3¼ miles the next one time. Then with adequate rest and recovery, we keep doing that. And before long, that's our new baseline, right? That's not easy to do. And we can keep stretching past that. So we're building capacity. But it works the same basic way in all of these domains. So mental, our attention span, our capacity to focus, are we flexible, mentally flexible? One of the hallmarks of aging, by the way, is lack of mental flexibility, if you will, not just physical. It's actually true. But these are things we can also, skills we can learn, and we can deplete our mental energy, right? I know at the end of the day, I've had the experience many times of I'm reading a book or a paragraph or whatever it is, and I finish reading it and I realize I haven't a clue what I just read, right? You might be able to relate to that. The spiritual domain I won't really go into because Bruce just gave a great kind of a presentation on that. In the military, this is often called moral injury. It would be another term for it. And this can be a major energy drain for us. But the emotional one is the one that I'm going to focus on because this is where most of us tend to unnecessarily lose a lot of our energy. And this has to do with primarily our capacity to self-regulate our emotions and the kind of the ratio of positive versus negative outlook, these types of things, emotional flexibility, the ability to experience a range of emotions. And this is where we kind of tend to cut off from our emotions. And the thing is, when we deny and cut off what we would call, depleting emotions, that also depletes or cuts off our ability to experience more positive emotions, the things that bring quality to life, that feel good. But one of the reasons that really understanding the emotional domain is that they are the primary drivers of the activity in our major body systems. And this is so easy to show here in the lab. It's not really our thoughts, but it's our feelings that are the big drivers of our hormonal activity, of the activity in our nervous system, of blood pressure, all of these major body systems. We can have you wired up here in the lab and, having you do subtractions and mental stuff. And yeah, we measure changes. But once you trigger a feeling, once you get frustrated because you're not subtracting the numbers right or embarrassed, big changes happen quick in our body, in our blood pressure, in our hormonal flows and nervous system activity. And emotions are also what make life worth living, right? They really determine why we do the things we do, right? When a lot of the military trainings I was involved in, I did trainings in all branches of the military, not just the Navy, although that was our primary large contracts. I would often ask the group, how many of you are in this role, in this job for the paycheck? And a few would raise their hand, and that's fine. And then I would basically ask them, well, how many of you are in this job, in this role that you have because you care about our way of life? And you have the courage to really do this role in this job. About everybody would raise their hand, right? And those are emotions, right? The dignity we have, the care we have to protect the ones we love. These are emotions. So they're not something that we need to be, all those squishy things that we don't have. Of course we have them. It's what's really learning about how do we learn to use them to our benefit, right? And to understand them. Now here's an example of why, an easy way to show how emotions really drive physiology. So we do a lot of work monitoring what's called heart rate variability, or you can think of it for right now, heart rate in the real world. People wear recorders as they go about their day, their jobs. And this is data from basically a husband who's in the passenger seat of the car. So there's no physical activity here. That's the main point. And right out of his log, where we ask people to kind of log things that go on and happen, him and his wife got into an argument. He said right out of his log, he said something was said that got him upset. And we see that his heart rate's going from what you would expect, kind of riding as a passenger around 60, up to basically 140. That's over almost a half hour there. And I happen to know this individual, and they couldn't maintain that high of a heart rate for that long through physical exercise if their life depended on it. So it just shows the power of emotions to drive physiology. And then the second little red arrow where they kind of end the argument kind of made up, I'm okay, you're okay. But look what his heart rate's still up at over 100. And it took another hour after the hour you're seeing here for that to finally get down to its starting point. So think of just even physiologically, how much energy just got depleted and used here, right? So if you think about it, the times that we've gotten angry, we have a good old anger outburst. It might feel good in the moment, but how do we feel 20 minutes later, a half hour later? Really depleted typically, right? So that's a good example of how we burn a lot of our energy in that emotional domain. So it's really resilience and energy management it's about balance. Because if we are always expending energy without the capacity and the ability to recover that's what really leads to burnout, to health challenges, to lowered resilience. It's really we're not repleting as much energy as we're expending at the bottom line. So it's really how do we learn to become more aware of our energy and our energy expenditures, and how do we not only not waste energy, but how do we add energy? How do we recover it? And interestingly, one of the most devastating things to people's energy and long-term depletion is actually cynicism, being cynical. And this dates back in the research field quite a few years now. It used to be a thing called type A personality. Some of you might have remember that from back in the older days, kind of when I was first getting involved in the field, and actually very good friends with a lot of the original researchers on that. And what they discovered was that the original type A personality, hard charging, get stuff done personalities, wasn't the problem. What they got as I got more fine-tuned, it was basically cynicism and anger that was correlated to heart disease, for example. But in the research in burnout now, obviously burnout has to do with expending more energy than recovering, and that's part of it. But what the more current and modern research is showing is that it's cynicism that is the real culprit in burnout. It's that cynical personality type, or everything, nothing's, I'm going to kind of manage some of the words I use here, but you kind of get hopefully the idea that it's that kind of under that inner simmer of anger and down slanting everything that is really the main driver of burnout. So a lot of that really traces back to a hostile work environment. Where we tend to develop those problems, cynical personalities. So a lot of work in the military. The graph I'm showing you here that is directly from military research, and I think it's so relevant to the first responder community. And what has been found that is, there's this idea that stress increases performance. And that's sort of true. And one of my mentors was actually created the American Institute of Stress, who from Hans Selye, who coined the term stress. And so there's this idea out there that stress increases performance. However, it's not quite. There's more to it. In reality, if we have a challenge, whatever that challenge it is, it could be something that we really like doing, for example, like sports. It's a challenge that if our heart's into it, think of it that way, and we embrace the challenge, that can and does increase performance. That's the blue line you see here, if we embrace that challenge. However, if we don't embrace it, we're being asked to do something, work a second shift, do something that we really don't like doing. We got to get a report written by next so-and-so, next Wednesday or something, and we're just not into it. That actually does not increase performance. It actually goes the other way. But if we embrace it, and let's say it's a sustained challenge, in this case, this is deployment for in military, we do have that original increase in performance, and there's a period of a maximum efficiency, where we can sustain that for typically about 30 days, if the challenge kind of remains the same, right? But what happens after that is what it was called the hyperreactive stage. This is where we're starting to get edgy. We're starting to get more reactive and quicker to anger, and the little things that didn't really bother us back in the earlier periods start to trigger us and bother us and create all the emotional turmoils. And this is also the stage where accidents happen. This is where we start making mistakes and people start getting hurt, is in this hyperreactive stage. And you can see with the red line, performance levels is starting to really drop significantly over the next 20, 30 days typically. And if that continues, the challenge without people learning the skills to regulate their energy, that goes into what's called the emotional exhaustion phase. But this is the burnout phase, the phase where we're starting to really make mistakes and start having health challenges, starting to have family issues, these types of things, starting to drink more, all of the kind of things that go along with that phase to try and recover. And if that continues long enough, then it kind of shows up in various different health challenges. It doesn't have to be that way. In fact, the blue line has been confirmed in multiple studies now that if we really do learn energy management skills, how to better self-regulate, especially our emotional energy, that there's going to be over time, if we are in a sustained challenge, energy is going to drop, but it doesn't have to crash. We don't have to go into that burnout phase or into that emotional exhaustion phase. I'll give you some examples of that. So some of the things that really cause that depletion of energy, they're the obvious things: long work hours. A lot of people these days have financial stress and uncertainty. One of the big ones is sleep, which I'll talk about a little bit more next, because that's one of the main ways we recover our energy, that we recharge our inner batteries, is through sleep. Emotional danger. A lot of and first responders are in truly dangerous contacts, not only physically but emotionally, and Bruce spoke to some of that earlier as well. Kind of another one that's can really take a whack on our emotions is unexpected change. Changes that come from upper management, these kind of changes that don't make sense oftentimes. We don't understand them, especially if they're unexpected. The way our brains are wired, that's a whole other presentation, is we don't like change. We like the familiar. And then so when there's a change from the familiar, that's a huge source of stress. But stress, again, being the emotions that we're experiencing, the drama, the frustration, and so on. Communication issues, another huge one. In fact, about 70% of mistakes, workplace mistakes, trace back to communication issues, and so on. Now, I kind of mentioned the importance of sleep. And just share two studies that both of these come out of military research as well. But this is a study here that's using a performance task that's looking at just being awake. How does that affect our performance? And they compared that to blood alcohol levels. In other words, taking a few drinks. And basically what this study shows is that after just being awake for 17 hours, that our performance is dropped to the level of being legally intoxicated. So just simply being awake for that long. And it gets the longer we're up and awake, you can see here, the longer that drop in performance happens. So how many shifts, especially if you're working night shifts and other shifts, have we been awake for 17 hours or longer? So this becomes a really important factor. Now, this is another study that's showing the importance of sleep. Excuse me. In this study, there were 4 different groups, and the lucky group had the opportunity to get 9 hours of sleep. That's the one with the little boxes and going across. The other group was able to get, the black line, 7 hours of sleep, and then 5 and 3 respectively for a week of sleep restriction. And they were their performance was being assessed throughout this. And what you can see here is that as each night with sleep restriction, that especially the 3 and the 5 hour groups, their performance was dropping pretty significantly, way past that level of being legally intoxicated. And the authors of the study thought, well, we'll give them 3 days to recover after this study. Not that that would be adequate. That wasn't the case. If you look over after in the recovery period, really all the groups, in fact, it took over a week for them to get back to their normal level of performance after sleep restriction. And the scary part of this study, in a way, was they asked the people to self-rate their level of performance. How well do you think you're doing? And they were horrible at it. In other words, subjectively, they were completely unaware of the lack of performance that they had, of how poorly they were really performing. So we're really not good at self-judging, our sensory motor integration and these types of skills, which these tasks do. We really just can't do it. So it's something to really pay attention to, especially if we're in management of the sleep that our people are able to get. So how do we keep our inner battery charged? And Jen Hart's after my presentation, going to give you some very practical skills. But how do we keep that inner battery charged? And just to give a little background on the physiology here, a term we use a lot is coherence. And in science, I mean, most of us have, I think, an idea of what coherence means. It's a good thing, right, to be coherent. But coherence has to do with describing the degree of harmony, if you will, among the parts of a complex system like us. All the glands, the organs, the different systems in the body, the immune system, hormonal system, different glands and organs have to be able to work together coherently in a harmonious way to be a healthy system, to really maintain function over time, stability. And in a coherent system, when the parts are working together, it's energy efficient. Is a key concept within coherence. And another aspect of coherence is that the output or the wholeness is greater than the sum of the parts. In other words, they're all working together, gives us new abilities that we don't have just at the lower level. So all the things have to be connected for that to happen. They have to be synchronized. And so synchronization is a key aspect of a coherent or optimal system. And this is the kind of frontier work, the new work in physiology, our hearts and brains, it's the synchronized activity or the brain's ability to synchronize its own electrical activity that is critical for even being awake and conscious. For when we have a head injury, for example, and people go into a coma, what really is underneath that is the brain can no longer synchronize its own activity because of certain neural circuits. I won't go into the neurophysiology that allows us to synchronize the brain's activity. But what we're starting to see is there's degrees of synchronization of our capacity to synchronize. And that's what really underlies our ability to have accurate perceptions, to perceive the world correctly, to have a balanced emotional experience, to learn, to make good decisions, to perform well. So it's really about how do we get in sync physiologically, because if our underlying neural systems that allow us to think clearly, to make decisions are out of sync, it basically directly impairs decision making. Now, one of the ways, this is probably basic for some of you, but it may not be for everybody listening, so I'll cover it. There are two different branches of what's called the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic system you can think of as the gas pedal. So when more neural activity is flowing through that neural pathway down through the system, it speeds things up, speeds up heart rate. It's shutting down systems we don't need, like digestion, because it's really about mobilizing energy. So it raises heart rate. So we want a good, healthy sympathetic nervous system. We need it to take care of business, to get out of bed and do things. And it's what's traditionally been called the fight-flight, right, and the stress reaction system. That's a little oversimplified because the sympathetic nervous system is not a bad guy. It basically, when we need to use energy, whether it's in sports or hobbies, anything we do, climb the stairs that we do, we need a healthy sympathetic system. Now, it is associated with fight or flight because we need to have the energy to either engage or get away from the situation. So it's activated, though, whenever we feel uncomfortable or threatened. There's an unconscious activation of this system. Now, in today's world, fight and flight, it's still this unconscious, hardwired system, but it has to do more with being over aggressive would be one of the ways in today's world. That's kind of the modern fight, over dramatic about things, arguing, that some people just have that personality, a cynical person that has to argue about everything, for example. So we're keeping that system activated. But on the flight side, what we're doing in today's world, it's more about disengagement. We emotionally disconnect and separate from people. Is one of the chief factors of the sympathetic system. Now, a lot of people talk about, the fight flight as if that's the only response we have. And of course, that's not true, but it's still presented that way oftentimes. As humans, we have what's called the social engagement system. Now, this is our capacity to self-regulate, right? This is where we can pause, we can make an inner choice, and we can basically inhibit those automated or automatic response patterns that we might have. So it's that power to pause and choose. And that's really where it gets down to our capacity to self-regulate, to grow, to mature. And the foundation of that system is the other half of the nervous system. It's called the parasympathetic system. And this goes down through the front of the body and what are called the vagus nerves. A lot of discussing about that these days. So it's more activated when we feel safe, when we feel comfortable, right? It's about conserving energy. It's about regulating energy in the body and adding energy. And it's really the foundation of the social engagement system. I may not agree with you, but hey, we can self-regulate. Let's talk about it. Let's come to maybe we'll never agree, but we don't have to fight and we don't have to separate. We can still, have an emotional connection. So our capacity to be patient. So patience activates this system. Engaging with others, that social engagement, having friends, having connections, collaborations, working together, caring are all involved in activating of this system. But these two nervous systems have to work together in a harmonious way to be a coherent, in sync physiology in our body, the synchronization of all the body's inner systems. Now, as it turns out, the heart is a key player in all this. Now, I'll start with the second comment bullet here. The heart sends more information to the brain than the heart. I mean, the heart sends far more information up to the brain than the brain sends down to the heart. Now, that's not a new finding. This has been known since the late 1800s. In fact, psychology and understandings were based on this until about the 1930s. And then we kind of englamored with the brain and forgot about the rest of the body. And it wasn't until the 1970s that this all changed, and it was rediscovered in a way that the neural signals being sent from the heart to the brain have profound effects on brain function. There are neural pathways going directly at all the major brain centers, especially the frontal cortex, our ability to self-regulate. But the amygdala, our centers for emotionality, are directly influenced by the information coming up from the heart. And so the amygdala is determining what's familiar and not familiar. It's not really the fear center. It's really familiar, not familiar, but that's a whole other presentation. But so in fact, the researchers of that day were writing literally in their papers that the heart acts like it has a mind of its own. What they didn't know was that the heart actually does have a mind of its own at that day. It's called the intrinsic cardiac nervous system, and now nicknamed the heart brain. And this is studied by a field called neurocardiology. So there's a very complex neural system within the heart. And these neurons in the heart have short-term memory, long-term memory, neurogenesis, all the functions of a brain. I'm just going to keep it simple for today, but a lot of work has gone into that anatomy. So it's this interaction between the activity in the heart and the brain through the two branches of the nervous system that create what's called heart rate variability. And I'll show you a picture of that in a second here. But an optimal amount of this natural variability is really important. It's reflecting not only our health status, but our ability to self-regulate, to adapt, to be resilient. So the amount of this variability we have is really important. And if it's lower than it should be for our age, that's one of the best measures we have of that we've depleted our reserves, our energy reserves that I've been talking about. And it's one of the main reasons we get depleted is chronic stress. It's the long-term day after day of being exposed to those challenges I was talking about. And so it self-regulates our ability to self-regulate. So this is what heart rate variability really is. So on the bottom of this slide is the electrocardiogram. Each one of the spikes is a heartbeat. And what I want you to kind of take away from this is that the time between each pair of the heartbeats, each consecutive pair, is always changing. And this is what's called heart rate variability, which is quite different than heart rate, which is simply how many times does the heart beat in a minute. But it's always changing. And the blue line is plotting those changes in time. And this is what creates our heart rhythm. Now, if the time between each pair of heartbeats was the same, the blue line on top would be a flat line. Not a good thing, right? That's reflecting depletion and lack of capacity to self-regulate. And the reason the heart rate variability is so important, it's a quick window we can get into the dynamic activity going on in the whole nervous system and the communication between the heart and brain, right? Because that's what we have to get in sync for optimal function. So this image now is heart rate variability, the heart rhythm. We can keep it that simple over a longer period of time now. And these two images, these two graphs are from the same person. And the one on the left is what we call an incoherent heart rhythm. And this is what our rhythm looks like when we're feeling things like frustration, impatience, irritation, anger, fear, look way worse. It's this chaotic rhythm. And this is going all the way back to the 70s. The term that was coined to describe the effect that this kind of rhythm has on brain function was called cortical inhibition. In other words, the cortex, the part of our brain that we get paid to go to work for, right, where we can think clearly, self-regulate, is literally inhibited. It's kind of taken offline. The rhythm on the right, same person, only a few minutes later after this. But this is what our heart rhythm naturally looks like when we're feeling things like calm, patience, appreciation. And appreciation doesn't have to be some big thing. It can simply be we walk out the door in the morning and it's just one of those days, the blue skies and the right temperature, and we just have that feeling, oh God, what a beautiful day. That's appreciation, although we may not think that or say that to ourselves. We're naturally going into this more coherent rhythm. Because what's important to understand is the coherent rhythm is reflecting synchronization within the whole neural system. The higher centers in our brain, the nervous system, and the communication going back and forth between the heart and brain. So it's a way we can get a very quick read of how synchronized is the activity in the whole neural axis, heart, brain, and nervous system. And that's the rhythm that's associated with what was called back in the term coined back in the 70s, cortical facilitation. And it directly is a direct reflection of increased neural synchronization within the brain and within our nervous system and between the heart and brain, all things we can directly measure. And that one thing, just a note here, that a coherent rhythm is not to be confused necessarily with relaxation. Of course, that's an important skill, being able to relax. But with some practice, you can learn to be in a coherent rhythm at almost any heart rate. So after all, there's a lot of situations where we need to take care of business, especially in the first responder community. You want a higher heart rate, but we want to be coherent. So we can think of coherence as composed. We're really in sync. We have all of our mental faculties. We are facilitated now. We have more capacity to self-regulate, to take those quick inner pauses to make before we just react from old automated reaction patterns. And we know a lot about now these days about the mechanisms of all this. It's pretty simple at the end of the day, although it took a lot of labs to work all this out. Basically, because we have all the ascending neural information from the body, but especially the heart, one of the centers that this information is going to, these patterns, is the part of the brain called the thalamus. And it has many jobs, but one of its roles is to synchronize the activity of the entire brain. So when we're in that incoherent state, it's basically desynchronizing neural activity. Now, it's easy to measure this in terms of reaction times, coordination tasks. And this is why when we get angry or frustrated or impatient, that our performance drops. In sensory motor integration, our reaction times are measurably impaired in performance. But it especially affects the frontal part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is where we self-regulate from, where we're able to discriminate appropriate behaviors, kind of the foresight functions from. So those those capacities, those functions require a greater degree of synchronized activity to perform well. So those get taken offline. So this is why when we really get, out of balance emotionally and upset, we can do stupid things, right? Because we've lost that capacity of foresight and self-regulation. And this is so important, but it doesn't have to be that way, because with some practice, we can shift right into the coherent rhythm and facilitate those same functions. And this is actually why coherence training is so popular in professional and Olympic athletics. A lot of teams now are really onto this. And I know of 2 or 3 world records that have been set after people have learned athletes learning to get coherent. But you don't have to be an athlete. This is something that affects everyone. Now, just being in learning how, and Jen's going to share some techniques to get there in a few minutes, but just when you're in that coherent state, using a technique, you may not feel much, but there is a lot going on in terms of our physiology. We're rebalancing or resynchronizing, if you will. And that has a carryover effect into our next action. So in a lot of our work with military, law enforcement, and different first responder communities, it's really learning how to shift into coherence while we're on the go, right? So just taking a moment, even a minute, to get coherence before we go knock on our door if we're in a call or the next activity, because it really does reset the hormonal system, the nervous system, into this balanced state, allowing us to have a lot more mental and emotional composure and stability as we go into that. And this can be measured, right? We can directly see that coherence directly relates to increased performance, in this case, sensory motor integration performance, whereas just getting relaxed doesn't do that. So because relaxation doesn't necessarily lead to increased synchronization. And kind of go through this fast because I'm trying to make up some time here. But so there's over 400 studies now, independent studies, showing that when people learn how to become more coherent through coherence training, that it has a lot of benefits, especially our ability to maintain our composure, that emotional balance, no matter what's going on in the external world, our capacity to maintain the inner composure. Fatigue, exhaustion, greatly reduced. It facilitates the body's capacity to heal itself. Coordination, learning, thinking more, being able to think more clearly. This is some results in almost 12,000 people. We have more than that now, but this is primarily healthcare workers. This is doctors and nurses across a lot of hospitals here in the U.S. And you see that after coherence training, 6 weeks after, exhaustion, tiredness is cut in half. Their inner batteries are more charged. Depression, 9% to 4%. Anxiety, annoyance, anger, all way significantly decreased. So there's direct effects on our mental and emotional. So we call it, you're not always going to be in this coherent heart rhythm while we're running around, doing our work activities and things, but we can still, that carryover effect allows us to maintain what we call operational coherence. In other words, to sustain our composure and create more flow when life out there is not necessarily flowing. But it just really has to do with by learning to better self-regulate our energy, our emotional energy. But the key here is in the moment, right? Right in the moment that we start getting triggered or we start feeling anxious or angry or frustrated or impatient, we can learn to right in that moment, nobody even needs to know you're doing it, self-regulate those. So a couple of things, of key concepts here that are actually pretty easy to do once we learn how and get familiar with it. I mentioned prep is preparing for us, one of the key aspects of resilience or definition of resilience. So prepping just means getting coherent before we engage in different interactions or presentations or interactions with the public or whatever that might be, colleagues. And when we're all life's going to happen. We're going to get triggered. We're going to get upset. And we can learn how to shift and reset to maintain our composure when that happens a lot more quickly. Just take some teaching and some learning and some how-to skills and some practice. Here's I'll show you a little bit more of this in a few minutes here. I'm almost done. But this is getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I wanted to show you this in the case of resetting. We did a study here in California with 6 police departments. It was actually a fun study to do, where we were doing very realistic scenarios. I mean, these are, we had Moffett Air Force Base, and we were doing high-speed chases, right, while we're monitoring the officers and the bad guys and building searches. These aren't computer simulations. These are real-world things that are being monitored. And in these scenarios, I'm showing you domestic violence because this is obviously where I think most of you here know most officers get hurt. Is that standing still? This is you got the screaming wife over here and the potential bad guy over here, all very kind of being acted out. But this officer's heart rate up is at almost 180, standing still. Again, the effects of these kind of stressors. And after the scenario was over, this is very typical. And for many of these officers, their heart rate didn't get back down to normal for the whole rest of their shift. And we did an after action debrief, what color was the bad guy's shirt, how many shots were fired, if it was a shoot scenario, all these things. And it was really amazing how poorly they performed at that. But after the training and practicing the self-regulation techniques for 30 days, you see what happens over here, the shift and reset using the technique. They were able to almost instantly bring their physiology back to balance. And they did significantly better than on the cognitive thing, on tests, what was the after action debrief. It just shows in a measurable way how we can do that. One of the first steps of a lot of the techniques, which I'm not going to go into here because you're going to have another presentation that gets into the practical side, but hard focused breathing is something that you can do right in the moment, anytime, to really stop the stress and rebalance our physiology in the moment. You got to breathe anyway. Right? Nobody knows you're doing it. So it really enables us to take that inner pause and choose how we're going to respond rather than just, our normal kind of automatic reactions. So basically it's pretty simple. You literally focus your attention in the center of the chest, in the area of the heart, and just imagine your breath is flowing in and out of your heart or chest area. You breathe a little slower and deeper than usual, but basically find an easy rhythm. So that's the first step in self-regulation that you can pretty much do any time. You just have to a little bit of practice with it. There's technology that allows us to measure our heart rhythms in real time, which is a great training tool. Are we really making that physiological shift? It's because the underlying physiology has everything to do with our mental and emotional composure, right? So we want to get it synchronized. And this gives us a very easy, inexpensive way to see that, to practice that. And if we practice it in times we're not in a high challenge situation, that really enables us to make those shifts in real challenges. So I'm just kind of take you through that study I was just talking about. This was a program of 6 the police departments here in California. And some of the impact, this is 30 days before and after learning the self-regulation skills. So coping skills, family relationships, work performance, interpersonal skills. You can see that this is differences between the control group and the experimental group. Some pretty big changes, improvements in those kind of factors. One of the assessments in stress and well-being, you can see the red is the train group, the yellow is the control group. But pretty big reductions in negative emotions, anger, distress, depression, sadness, fatigue, 18, almost 20% reductions in those. More positive emotions, more vitality, right? Than all significant, highly significant compared to the control group. So these self-regulation techniques have a lot of benefits across a lot of things. Physical symptoms, sleeplessness, 17% reduction versus the control group, increasing by 6%. Anxiety, body aches, indigestion, and so on. Now, one of the things we also did in this study is we measured how much heart rate variability they have, which is done over a 24-hour period with recorders. And this is kind of a complicated looking slide, but I'll just tell you the punchline. The amount of heart rate variability we have is it's a very important measure of health risk and health status. And so low variability for our age is one of the strongest predictors of future health problems that is currently known. And what we found here is that almost twice the incidence of these police officers had lower variability for their age than would be expected in the general population, almost double, which kind of mirrors a lot of the other health-related measures in first responder community. So it also provides a way of early risk detection. These are very relatively inexpensive tests that can be done. We could be monitoring our officers and finding who is really depleted emotionally, physiologically, their resilience is depleted, and bringing in some early intervention. This is not rocket science. It's relatively straightforward to do. So that's my last slide.
Okay, great. Hi, Dr. McCraty. Thank you so much. We do have 10 minutes for Q&A with Dr. McCraty, and actually a couple of questions have come in. So I'll just read them out right now. So a participant asks, is a firefighter and EMS burnout similar to police officer as far as exhaustion and cynicism is concerned?
Oh, sure, of course. I mean, it doesn't matter what occupation you're in. But I do, find that cynicism, is probably a little higher in I think the first responder community than some other professions. But it's pretty rampant in today's world too. I think it's something that's on the increase in many professions.
Thank you, Dr. McCraty. We have another question here, and that is, have the long-term effects from hazing ever been addressed in this work?
Not that I know of, but I mean, we could put that, depending on certainly the bullying, hazing type of things, is a source of trauma, and that can have very long-lasting effects on people, and in some cases can fall into that moral injury category, and that's one of the worst things we can do for our long-term health and resilience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have another question here, which is there a connection between dark gallows type humor and cynicism in the first responder community? So that dark gallows humor and cynicism, and what would be a healthy alternative to dark humor? And I guess, are dark humor and cynicism similar? Are they connected?
Yeah, I would say they are. And, what's a healthy alternative? Well, is really, I think, caring more. Dark humor, it's really at somebody else's expense, typically. And it's, nothing wrong with humor. Humor's great. But not if it has, if any time that you're down slanting others, in a joking way, well, there's always something under that, from my perspective, that is really not adding energy. Those are exactly the kind of things that deplete us, or those we don't use words like positive and negative emotions for a lot of reasons, but the physiological reality still is that certain types of emotions deplete energy and others renew them. So that's why we call them depleting emotions and renewing emotions, because of the effects they have physiologically. So anytime it's those kind of down slant emotions, that is a depleting thing for ourselves and hurtful to others.
Thank you. Another question has come in, and that is, could you help us understand how accumulated stress injury or post-traumatic stress injury causes disconnection in brain function or brain activity?
Well, boy, that would be, yes. We could do a whole presentation on that. And just let me mention, we do have at the HeartMath Institute a program on trauma that really is ideal, I think, for the first responder community, and especially those working in the first responder community, that really goes deeply into that question. But let me say it as simply as I can here. The way our brain works is that we have what you could think of as implicit or unconscious memories, and a trauma really shifts what we, in our language, we call shifts what our inner baseline that we're always comparing the now to. And so everything we perceive goes through this process. So if we have a traumatic event that creates a baseline associated with, fear and so on, that is what something triggers us, because it's a match to that familiar pattern that we've established in the brain. And as it turns out, this is actually really important in the work in trauma and PTSD and what in general is healthy function, is that the only way that we can establish and change these inner reference points is by changing the inputs to the brain from the body. And the heart turns out being one of the primary sources to do that. So when we're in that coherent rhythm using these kind of coherence techniques, it's one of the fastest ways of resetting the baselines within the brain that underlie PTSD and traumatic events, or just accumulated events over time that create these baselines. So there's a whole lot more to that, but
That's brilliant. Absolutely. Let's talk more about the heart in the time that we have here. We have a few more minutes. So I have a question that's come in. Last Thursday, we learned in our time with Deb Dana and Stephen Porges that the ventral vagal is contagious in terms of like that community connection. Is it similar with heart coherence?
Absolutely. In fact, Steve's a friend of mine. So and in fact, Steve's the guy who coined the term social engagement system that I was talking about. And of course, he's talking the vagus nerves are the main nerve of the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system, which is why hence the term social engagement. But absolutely. And Steve and I agree on a lot of things. He also talks a lot about the ascending pathways from the heart, not just the brain going down, where a lot of people are stuck these days, I think, in their understanding. But yes, so when we're in a coherent rhythm, we're increasing vagal activity, which is a lot of what he's talking about. And so we're really strengthening those self-regulation circuits. In fact, there was a study just published like last month that showed that the coherence practice, getting the sine wave high coherent rhythm, is measurably changing the neural wiring in the brain, specifically in the self-regulation circuits, which is exactly what Steve is typically talking about.
That's fabulous. So I've got so many questions around that. Another one has come in from a participant, and that is, HeartMath coherence practices are really wonderful. We can practice them on our own, and we can practice them in a group. Say in a first responder setting, are there strategies that first responders could share in the moment to help people return to coherence, say, on the scene? For example, in a domestic violence situation. But second part of that is in terms of self-care, because first responders are very good at taking care of others. Are there practices that first responders could do together to co-regulate together?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The answer is yes to both of those questions. In fact, one of the things we teach in our trainings in organizations, whether it's law enforcement, fire, hospitals, corporations, is we suggest before like a meeting or a staff meeting or a briefing, take a minute. It's all it takes, and together get coherent. Take a minute and do one of the techniques like heart focused breathing or quick coherence, the various techniques, And because when you do it together, you are starting to build a group coherence. And that's something else we can measure, by the way. We have another app that actually allows you to measure the group's coherence. And as we get more coherent together, you are actually building and strengthening, kind of simply said, pro-social behaviors and opening up communication channels. And we actually have measures for team or group coherence. We can actually measure that. And in fact, there's a whole program for team performance, getting the team coherent or the group. So certainly that can be done. And in some of our other certification programs, there's a whole section on quick interventions. We especially teach these in our programs for hospitals. There's somebody coming into the emergency room, they're freaked out. Very quick de-escalation techniques that you can teach them and how to do that, how you can guide them through that. And there's absolutely no reason that can't be done. Whether you're in fact, there's some of the work with police departments, they actually do it. The detectives, when they're interviewing suspects, have found that they get a lot more information a lot more quickly if they help them find their balance, because of course they're nervous and anxious and kind of freaked out. But if you're dealing with people with mental health issues, for example, as a first responder or domestic violence calls, there are absolutely things that you can kind of help guide them to do without them really even knowing what you're doing, that can help de-escalate their emotional reactions by helping them get their physiology more balanced, right? Because whenever we're freaked out, there's an underlying physiological imbalance that underlies that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've come to the end. I did want to request, you mentioned the Dartmouth study, which sounds like a very important study for our first responder community to take a look at. So if you had a moment, Dr. McCraty, if you could send that link to us, because we don't have that link, and I will put that in the chat for everybody.
Okay. Yeah, there's several relevant studies. There's studies in correctional officers as well, and the police study. I'm happy to share some of those resources with you all.
Yeah. And I think I have access to some of them too. I'll go through my notes and find them and get those. So what I'd like to say is thank you so much. So helpful to learn more about the HeartMath research and practices, energy balance, operational balance, heart-brain connection, and coherence training. And of course, we're looking forward to Jen, where we'll be learning some of these quick coherence and various coherence practices that first responders can bring into their day-to-day life and into practice in their departments. Thank you so much for the incredible work at the HeartMath Institute, and we are very grateful for the research and the drill skills that have come forward from HeartMath. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lillian, and everyone have a great rest of your day.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dr. McCraty. We are going to be posting 2 research papers from the HeartMath Institute, research conducted by Dr. McCraty and colleagues, and his colleagues in the chat box. And so that will be coming forth in just a minute. The papers are entitled HeartMath Approach to Self-Regulation and Psychosocial Wellbeing, and the other paper is entitled Resilience Training Program Reduces Physiological and Psychological Stress in Police Officers. Now we'd like to take a 15-minute break. Please take time to take care of yourself. We're going to actually go offline, so we will ask you to log back in and we will be reconvening at 11:40. So log back in a few minutes before 11:40. We're going to try to keep the schedule. We'll be looking forward to welcoming Jennifer Hart, Senior Probation Officer of Wellness and Peer Support Coordinator at San Diego County Probation Department, and Jen will be presenting the first Drills and Skills workshop of the day entitled Creating Calm in Chaos. We look forward to seeing you back here at 11:40. Thank you.